living in a moment right now when we have a constitutional law professor, Nobel Peace Prize winner, popular Democratic president who campaigned on a pledge to reverse the Bush-Cheney torture and killing apparatus, who is continuing many of the policies that liberals found so offensive when they were being done by a Republican administration. And I don't believe for a moment that if John McCain had won the election in 2008, that you would see liberals cheerleading the President of the United States conducting drone strikes in countries throughout the world or targeting American citizens who have not been charged with a crime in what are not targeted killing operations. They are assassinations. Today, we learned some breaking news, and that is that Attorney General Eric Holder sent a letter to Senator Patrick Leahy and other members of Congress admitting that the United States had carried out drone strikes to specifically target one American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico in 1971, and that 3 other Americans had been killed in drone strikes. But in his letter, Attorney General Holder used an interesting phrase to describe the other 3 Americans killed, and it's really sort of an Orwellian phrase. He said they were not specifically targeted. You know, this is an administration that also, in its assertions earlier in what was called the white paper from the Department of Justice, that it had the legal authority to kill American citizens. They said that they could kill American citizens if they were involved in imminent plots against the United States, but then they proceeded to redefine the word imminent in a way that someone with just a basic 4th grade education would know that's not the actual meaning of the term. We're living in a time that is so Orwellian because a Nobel Peace Prize winning constitutional law professor, popular Democratic president is in the White House and is legitimizing and normalizing assassination as a central component of what is called America's national security policy. In this letter that Eric Holder wrote to Senator Leahy, he attempted to litigate posthumously a case against Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen, and made allegations that Anwar al-Awlaki was directly involved with terrorist plots against the United States, that he had in fact directed the failed underwear bombing plot on December 25th, 2009, that he had told this young deranged Nigerian kid, Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, to wait until the plane was over the United States to detonate his bomb, that he was involved with imminent plots against the United States, and that the capture of this American citizen was not feasible. So the United States had no alternative but to target him for assassination. Of course, he doesn't use the term assassination, because every president since Gerald Ford has signed an executive order saying that the United States does not assassinate, and every single president since Gerald Ford has found a way around their own purported ban on assassination. Now, I want to say at the onset, maybe these allegations against Anwar al-Awlaki are true. Maybe al-Awlaki was directly involved with plotting acts of terrorism against the United States. Maybe everything that they've leaked about him is accurate. My question for them, if that's the case, is where's the indictment? Why not charge him with a crime? Why not go, as has been the standard for a couple hundred years plus in this country, why not go and seek an indictment against him if you have all this evidence, and then put forward the charges, present the evidence, and then give him a chance to respond to it? You see, I'm willing to concede that maybe all of those things are true, but if they are, indict him. And then you demand Anwar al-Awlaki's extradition, and you bring him back to the United States and you have him stand trial. You might even be able to charge him with treason. If you have evidence about all of these plots involving attempts to poison water supplies in the United States and directing people to blow up aircraft, that should be a slam dunk, to use a phrase that was popular during the Bush era. But Anwar al-Awlaki was never charged with a crime by the United States. His extradition was never demanded. How do you surrender? How do you surrender to an authority when you aren't responding to an indictment? Who do you surrender to? How do you surrender to a drone in the sky above you? See, to me, the question isn't about who was Anwar al-Awlaki. The question is, who are we? Who are we? What is our society? What message do we send to the world? If we want to portray our country as the shining city on the hill, a nation governed by the rule of law, then we can't say at times that for certain citizens, for certain people, we can have the mob go and get the pitchforks and the torches and round up the suspects and then deliver citizens' justice to them. If we want to do that, then stop saying that you're something else and start saying that in some cases we believe in mob violence, or we believe in assassination, or we believe that due process doesn't apply. This isn't only about who Anwar al-Awlaki is, it's about who we are, because a society isn't judged by how you treat the popular or the powerful or the law-abiding citizens. It's judged by how you treat the least of your people, how you treat the poorest of your people, and how you treat the most reprehensible of your citizens. Now, I'm a firm believer that it doesn't make a dime's worth of difference whether someone is an American or a non-American. On a moral level, it has no significance whatsoever. Everyone deserves the same human rights. The most astonishing thing to me about Eric Holder's letter, actually it's not astonishing, one of the most disturbing things about Eric Holder's letter is that he says nothing about the United States coming to terms with or explaining all of the non-Americans that they've killed around the world in drone strikes, cruise missile attacks, night raids. It's only the discussion of these 4 Americans, but I think it is relevant that they're Americans for this reason. How a society treats its own citizens will give you a sense of how they're going to treat non-citizens. And I guarantee you, if they're asserting the right to kill Americans without charging them with a crime or presenting any evidence against them in places other than anonymous officials leaking to the press, then the standards for killing non-Americans are far, far lower than that. But what I want to talk to you about tonight is who were these Americans that were killed? How did they become who they were? And why was the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki so important to the Nobel Peace Prize winning, constitutional law professor, Democratic president, that he was willing to cross this line? That I believe if John McCain as president would have crossed, if he won that election, you would see liberals calling for his impeachment. But because it's President Obama, somehow it's acceptable. I want to get a t-shirt made that said, I'm only against it when a Republican does it. Because there's a fierce intellectual dishonesty that permeates the debate on this administration's counterterrorism policy. Now, there may be a few people in here that know a bit more about Anwar al-Awlaki than what you've seen on YouTube, but bear with me as I tell you the story. Most people probably know 1 or 2 things about Anwar al-Awlaki. You know that he's the guy on YouTube in the camouflage jacket, in front of the black flag, calling for armed jihad against the United States, calling on young Muslims around the world to conduct attacks in their own countries in the West, or to come to Yemen or Somalia or Afghanistan and join the mujahideen on the fronts of jihad across the United States. Someone like Anwar al-Awlaki isn't created in a vacuum. And I'll tell you where those ideals were not created. They weren't created in his family growing up. I know the al-Awlaki family. I know his father, Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki, very well. This is an upstanding, impressive man who came to the United States in 1966 as a Fulbright scholar. And in his essay that he wrote when he was coming to study English first in Lawrence, Kansas, with an evangelical Christian family, before going to New Mexico State University, he wrote that he wanted to come to America because he was taken with the progressive spirit of the country and its history. And he wanted to get an education, and he wanted to raise his family in the spirit of America. And he wanted to go back to Yemen then and dedicate his life to dealing with that country's water crisis. So he comes to the United States, he gets his degrees, he brings his wife over, she gets her GED in the United States and works at a candy factory to support their family while Nasser al-Awlaki was getting his degrees. And in 1971, they have their first son, Anwar al-Awlaki. And Nasser al-Awlaki told me a story of how at that time you could light cigars up in hospitals, and he passed out "It's a Boy" cigars to everyone. And they're in New Mexico, and then they move to the Twin Cities in Minnesota, where Nasser al-Awlaki's at the university, and Anwar goes to school in the United States, and they go to Disneyland, and there's a picture of him in his classroom with all these other American kids pointing to Yemen on a globe and smiling, and a picture of him in front of the Mickey Mouse ears at Disneyland. And they're raising their family as an American family. And then Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki is offered a job back in Yemen, and he moves the family back there. They don't know for how long. And he works with USAID, with the US government, to build up a faculty of agricultural engineering at Sana'a University. And they were very close friends with all of the American diplomats. And Anwar then goes to an international school in both English and Arabic. English was his first language. And he attends school with the elite in Yemen. In fact, he went to school with the children of Yemen's dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Some of his classmates in school in Yemen would go on to be people colluding with the United States in the effort to hunt him down and kill him. So al-Awlaki goes, he finishes high school there, and then he returns to the United States in 1990 to go to university in Colorado. And I remember that period in time. I was 16 years old when the Gulf War started. I remember watching CNN and Bernard Shaw's Under the Desk in Baghdad, and Peter Arnett is there, and I remember thinking how extraordinary it was that there was someone named Wolf Blitzer, not to mention that he was covering the Pentagon. And al-Awlaki, as a college student, watches the bombing of Baghdad and the destruction of the civilian infrastructure in Iraq. And at that point, he was not a particularly religious guy, and he wasn't a political guy. He was going to study engineering at the university, but he became politicized by that war and started going to anti-war meetings. And then he was invited by a local imam in Colorado to come and speak at the mosque about what the students were saying and about the war in Iraq, a war against Iraq. And he goes and he gives a speech at the mosque, and the imam says, you have a real gift for speaking. I think you should come back. And he starts going to this mosque and starts to become more and more religious and decides that he doesn't want to be an engineer, that he actually wants to be an imam. And so he starts studying the Quran and Islamic scholarship and ultimately becomes an imam. And in 1995, his first son was born, Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, in 1995 in Denver, Colorado. And this young family moves around. They're in San Diego for a period. There's these pictures of al-Awlaki with a big, his big beard, fishing, and holding up the fish that he's caught. And, his white Christian neighbors all sung the praises of the al-Awlakis and said that they were, nice, affable people, that they would bring them fish that they had caught. And al-Awlaki was sort of starting to become a prominent Muslim leader in the United States in the 90s. And then on September 11th, al-Awlaki had been the imam for a few months at a large religious center in Virginia, at the Dar al-Hijra Mosque. And while at this mosque, al-Awlaki had become somewhat of a public figure in DC. And when the 9/11 attacks happened, he was all over the media. In fact, I remember trying to book him on Democracy Now! Because I had heard him on television. He was on PBS on the NewsHour. He was on NPR's Talk of the Nation with Ray Suarez. He was profiled by the Washington Post for a piece about Ramadan, because what he was saying at the time, I think, really resonated with a lot of people in the country and with a lot of Muslims. On the one hand, he was condemning the 9/11 attacks and was saying that the United States had a right to bring those to justice who had conducted those attacks. And he said that al-Qaeda had perverted the religion of Islam, but he also was condemning the hate attacks against Muslims and the bigotry that became so prevalent in many parts of the country, and the rounding up of and detaining of Muslims and the targeting of Islamic organizations and charities. He was such an accepted part of the official dialogue in DC at the time that he was actually invited by the Pentagon to come and give a speech inside the Department of Defense after 9/11 about the state of Islam in the world today. And in fact, he goes and gives this speech at the Pentagon. And we got the documents that show this. And among the documents, and this gives you a sense of how awesome the intelligence was in the Pentagon at the time, among the sandwiches they served was a bacon sandwich to an imam who's coming to their mosque. So al-Awlaki appeared to be on a certain trajectory and was becoming more and more prominent. Behind the scenes, though, he was being repeatedly interrogated by the FBI. It turns out that some of the 9/11 hijackers had attended one of his mosques in San Diego, and another had attended his mosque in Virginia, and they were sort of snooping around, and they kept pulling al-Awlaki in, and ultimately they determined that he didn't know the men individually, that he had maybe met them once or twice in his capacity as the imam, but that he didn't have anything to do with the attacks. But there was a lot of pressure being put on him behind the scenes, and in my book I go into detail about the FBI's efforts to convert al-Awlaki into being an asset for the FBI. And I think it's possible that for a period he actually was collaborating with the FBI. And I think part of why he ultimately decided to leave the United States is because the FBI was putting pressure on him to do more of their bidding. And this sounds like a familiar story. It plays out all the time. Now the FBI has become very good at breaking up its own terror plots in the United States. So al-Awlaki's under this pressure. The drumbeat for war in Iraq is intensifying. And he decides that he's going to leave the United States. So he moves his family, and he spends some time in England, but ultimately he decides that he wants to settle in Yemen. And he's sort of a lost soul. Maybe he's going to get involved with real estate there. He's attending classes. He starts recording sermons, Islamic sermons, and he's analyzing the U.S. foreign policy and the wars around the world and inside the United States, and talking about Abu Ghraib, and talking about Guantanamo, and talking about the invasion and occupation of Iraq, and the fighting that was going on in Somalia, and the war in Afghanistan, and the civilians that were being killed. And he's setting it all in a sort of Quranic context. And his sermons start popping up in terror investigations in Europe and in the United States. And so al-Awlaki is sort of ends up on the US radar in the mid-2000s, 2004, 2005. In 2006, al-Awlaki is arrested in Yemen. And he is put in prison, in a political prison in Yemen, on trumped-up charges that he had intervened in a tribal dispute. The United Nations investigated his imprisonment and said that it was extra-legal. Al-Awlaki's put in prison for 18 months, 17 of them in solitary confinement. He believed that he was put in that prison on orders from the United States. And indeed, the FBI came and interrogated him in this Yemeni prison. What I discovered in my reporting is that John Negroponte, who at the time was the director of national intelligence and knows a lot about dirty wars from his time in Central America in the 1980s, when he was in Honduras helping to facilitate the Contra war in Nicaragua and support for Battalion 316, his murderous death squad in Honduras, that Negroponte had a meeting about al-Awlaki while he was in prison with a senior Yemeni official and with Bandar Bush, the ultra-powerful Saudi diplomat who's called Bandar Bush because of his close relationship with the Bush family, the great handholders. And during this meeting, Negroponte says that it's the position of the United States that they want Anwar al-Awlaki kept in prison for 4 or 5 years so that people forget about him, so that young Muslims around the world aren't influenced by him. So they're essentially saying to an anti-democratic dictatorship in Yemen, keep one of our citizens in your prison because we don't like his speech, and we're afraid that his speech is going to incite young Muslims to violence. But it became politically untenable for the dictator of Yemen because the al-Awlaki tribe is very influential in that country and is a powerful tribe. And human rights groups and civic organizations were putting pressure on the Yemeni dictatorship to release him. And eventually, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the dictator of Yemen, is forced to release Anwar al-Awlaki. So he comes back out onto the streets. He moves back in with his parents, and his family is living there. And he starts a website, and the internet becomes his mosque. And he has come out of prison a fundamentally changed man. He was radicalized in an incredible way by being put in that prison and believing that the United States had put him in that prison. And so he's back on the streets, he's living in this home, he starts this blog, and he starts taking on issues like, is suicide bombing acceptable under the teachings of the Quran? And ultimately, if you read the essay, he decided that it was. And he's praising the victory of the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia and sending salutations to the militant movement al-Shabaab in Somalia and praising attacks against US forces. But he generally his speeches and his sermons were, by all accounts of the lawyers that I've talked to, well within the bounds of free speech. I mean, if you look at what some militias are allowed to write in the United States, they sort of make what al-Awlaki was doing at this period look a bit like child's play. Later, al-Awlaki crossed a different line, but if you look at the speeches that got him originally in the sort of crosshairs of the U.S. government, it was protected free speech. The U.S. government is putting all of this pressure on the Yemenis to rearrest him. They don't want him out. And in 2009, al-Awlaki decides that he is going to move away from the capital of Yemen and go to his tribal region of Shebwa, which is in the south of Yemen. And he believed that it would be easier for him to evade Yemen's intelligence agents if he went to this area. So he goes there, and in May of 2009, his father is approached by the head of Yemen's intelligence service. And he says to Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki, if you don't go and get Anwar to come back to Sana'a and agree for him to go back into our prison, the Americans are going to kill him with a drone. This is in May of 2009. This is before Nidal Hassan committed the Fort Hood massacre in Texas. This is before the underwear bomb plot. This is before anyone has even leaked an indication that Anwar al-Awlaki was involved with plotting acts of terrorism from within Yemen. And so they tell this to Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki, who himself has great relations with American diplomats, his lifelong friends. So he agrees to go down to Shebwa and try to convince his son to come back. And he goes and he meets with Anwar, and Anwar says, what are you, an American agent now? I'm not going to let the Americans tell me which way to position my bed at night. I was born free and I'll die free. And that was the last time that Nasser al-Awlaki spoke to his son. And then Anwar al-Awlaki decides that he needs to go underground, so he's effectively on the run at that time. Then in November of 2009, Nidal Hasan kills 13 of his fellow soldiers in Fort Hood and wounds scores of others and was paralyzed himself in that incident. Nidal Hasan was an army psychiatrist who had treated soldiers coming back from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and actually had tried to get some of his patients prosecuted, brought up on war crimes charges because of things that they had told him in the therapy session. And it was revealed that Nidal Hasan had been in email contact with Anwar al-Awlaki prior to the shootings at Fort Hood. And the story that continues to this day, that persists to this day, is that Anwar al-Awlaki either planned the Fort Hood shooting or that he was involved with it in some way or another. Well, the emails between al-Awlaki and Hasan have now been declassified. And if anything, Hasan is sort of like a creepy stalker. He's writing al-Awlaki letters saying, I want to give you a prize for being great, $5,000 prize. Al-Awlaki says, oh, give it to the orphans. I don't want your money. I want to have an essay contest in your name. At one point he says, can you help me find a wife in Yemen? And then al-Awlaki sort of says, I'll keep an eye out for a brother. You know, it's like a weird. So he's sort of, but then there's an email where Nidal Hasan really seems to indicate that he's contemplating some act of violence. And he's asking about it more in the context of Israel-Palestine. And al-Awlaki doesn't respond to that. So it seems from the emails that have been declassified that al-Awlaki didn't play any role except sort of being in limited correspondence with someone, as he was with hundreds, if not thousands, of other people who were readers of his blog. But the story persists that al-Awlaki was involved with that. What happened after that shooting, though, was what I think really sealed al-Awlaki's fate. The day after Nidal Hasan killed those soldiers, al-Awlaki posted a blog that said Nidal Hasan is a hero. And he called on other Muslims in the US military to do the same thing as Nidal Hasan. And that was the last blog post he wrote. The CIA shut down his blog. While all of this is playing out with al-Awlaki and President Obama, who's just into his first term of office, is being presented with all sorts of intelligence by the Joint Special Operations Command, which is the elite US military force, and the CIA. And they're saying there are major threats emanating from Yemen. We need to take preemptive action against them. And they begin pressuring, the generals begin pressuring Obama to authorize expanded operations in Yemen. And eventually, President Obama agrees. And on December 17th, 2009, the United States bombs Yemen in a cruise missile attack. It was the first US military attack in Yemen since 2002. When there was a lone drone strike authorized by President Bush that killed 6 Americans, including 1 American in that operation. His name was Kamal Darwish. But 7 years there hadn't been any strikes. Obama authorizes expanded strikes in Yemen. December 17, 2009, they strike an area of Abyan province called al-Majla. And what the CIA and JSOC told President Obama is that this is an al-Qaeda training camp. And we have a senior al-Qaeda figure who is residing in this camp, and we need to move now so that we can take him out. So Obama authorizes it. They do the cruise missile attack. Except the United States doesn't put out a press release saying, we just bombed Yemen. What happens is that the Yemeni government issues a press release saying Yemeni air forces have just struck an al-Qaeda camp and killed 34 al-Qaeda militants. And then the US government sends a congratulatory note to Yemen saying, good job, guys, on killing all these al-Qaeda terrorists. A brave young independent journalist in Yemen named Abdullah Haider Shaya travels to that village of al-Majla where this al-Qaeda training camp supposedly was and takes video and photo of the aftermath of this strike and takes images of what were clearly US cruise missiles and cluster bombs, which are banned under international conventions. These things are like flying landmines. They can shred human beings into meat. And he shows the bodies of babies, women, and children that have been shredded by these missiles in this attack, and begins talking about it around on Al Jazeera and on other media outlets. And because of his reporting there, the world knew that the United States had begun a bombing campaign against Yemen. David Petraeus, who at the time, General David Petraeus, was CENTCOM commander, flies to Sana'a and has a meeting with the dictator of Yemen and his henchmen. And they concoct a plot to have the United States bomb Yemen and have the Yemeni government take responsibility for it. And the deputy prime minister of Yemen says in that meeting with General Petraeus, I just lied to my parliament and told them we did this bombing. And then they laughed about it. And Ali Abdullah Saleh, the dictator of Yemen, says, you can continue bombing as long as we can say the bombs are ours and not yours, because he didn't want to, and for his own domestic reasons, didn't want to give the impression that he's letting the United States bomb his country. So he's saying, we'll take credit for these strikes, and you guys can just be the hidden, iron fist in the background. So they start bombing Yemen. This journalist has exposed it. Shortly after he exposes that it's a U.S. attack, shows the images of the cruise missiles, the cluster bombs, the dead women and children, he is abducted off the streets of Yemen. He is taken to the political security prison, which is supported by the United States. He is savagely beaten in that prison and told that if he doesn't shut up about the American missile attack, that they're going to put him back in there for good. And what he does that night is incredible. Abdullah al-Haider Shaya comes out of that political security prison, and he goes straight to Al Jazeera and onto the air, and he says, I was just arrested and beaten. He still has his bloodied clothes on. I was just arrested and beaten, and they told me that if I keep talking about this, they're going to put me back in prison. And he kept talking about it, and he kept reporting on it. And he also was interviewing members of al-Qaeda and doing critical reporting about them. The questions that he asked al-Qaeda members would make the White House press corps blush, because they never asked that tough of questions of U.S. officials. And this guy has the bravery to go and meet with al-Qaeda figures and actually ask them real questions, which is what journalists should be doing. We should be talking to the people that we're told are enemies. In fact, if I were running the CIA, and I don't like to tell the empire how to do its business, I would want Abdullah al-Haider Shaya interviewing al-Qaeda members, so A, I knew how they thought, but B, I might be able to follow the guy. But instead of doing that, they are harassing him and trying to shut him down. And eventually what happens is that his house is raided in a night raid. He is snatched from his home. He is taken to that prison and disappeared for 30 days. No one hears from him. His family doesn't know where he is. No human rights organizations know where he is. He just disappears, vanishes into the night. He then is brought into a special court that was set up by the dictator of Yemen to prosecute journalists for committing crimes against the state. And he's brought into court in a cage. And they put him there, and they charge him with offenses, some of which carried the death penalty. And what it boiled down to is they said he's an al-Qaeda facilitator, and he's engaged in plots to attack Western embassies in Yemen. And they didn't present any evidence, and no lawyer would even represent him because they didn't want to recognize the legitimacy of this farcical court. And it was condemned by every major international human rights organization, media freedom organization, civic organizations in Yemen and outside of Yemen. It was a sham trial of a journalist whose crime was exposing a U.S. cruise missile attack and not shutting his mouth when told. When he's in that cage, there's video of him in the courtroom who says, my one crime, my crime is exposing the American cruise missile attack that killed dozens of women and children in the Bedouin village of Al-Majla. That's my crime. And they sentenced him to 5 years in prison for being an al-Qaeda facilitator. So much pressure is then put on the dictator of Yemen to release him from outside of Yemen, from within Yemen. And eventually, after holding him for about a year, the dictator decides he's going to issue a pardon of Abdullah al-Haider Shaya. And word leaks in the local news agency that he's going to pardon him. And that day, the dictator of Yemen gets a phone call from the White House, not from some undersecretary of whatever, not even from Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, but from President Obama himself, personally. Obama calls the dictator of Yemen and says, the United States is very concerned about reports that you're going to release Abdullah al-Haider Shaya, and the pardon is ripped up. This is a journalist who remains in prison to this moment right now. He is in prison because the constitutional law professor, Nobel Peace Prize winning President of the United States is keeping him in prison. When I called the White House well after that phone call and asked what the current position is of the United States, they said the position is the same, he should stay in prison. And I said, well, can you present any evidence that he had anything to do with al-Qaeda except interviewing them as a journalist? And they said, we're going to make no further comment on this matter. So you have the journalist that exposed the first Obama-authorized missile strike in Yemen being put in prison for exposing the fact that it was actually an American cruise missile attack. When I went to Abyan province and we filmed, the missile parts are still there, and filmed the missile parts. You can see the General Dynamics logo on them. They say made in the United States. We also obtained a list of the dead from Al-Majla and other horrifying video that made my stomach turn, where you see limbs detached from bodies strewn across the desert. As one tribal leader who went there right after told me, you couldn't tell if it was goat, sheep, or human flesh that you were picking up trying in an effort to bury. There were 14 women killed in that strike and 21 children. A local leader, a tribal leader from this area, it's one of the poorest tribes in the south of Yemen, local tribal leader who had gone on an errand that morning, and so he wasn't there when the missile attack happened. He returns to see his family members killed, said to me when I asked him about the United States saying this was an al-Qaeda training camp, and he's showing me the pictures on his phone and telling me the names of all of these kids that are dead. He goes, this is so-and-so, she was in 2nd grade. This is so-and-so, he's in 4th grade. And he said to me, if you kill children and call them terrorists, then we're all terrorists. You know, if you kill children and call them al-Qaeda, then we're all al-Qaeda. Think about what he's saying, what the mentality is there. These people had never met an American before in their life until, you know, I'm standing face to face with them. And he's saying, you know, you're going to push us into the fold of the people you claim are the terrorists because to us, you're the terrorist. And that's a sentiment I heard in multiple countries around the world from people who had lost loved ones. You know, and I'm talking about innocent civilians who were killed in these targeted killing operations. So this is the environment that's going on when al-Awlaki is first on the run. The United States first tries to kill al-Awlaki in December, on December 24th, 2009, so a week after this. The next day then is the underwear bomb plot. Al-Awlaki then praises the underwear bomb plot, but says, I wasn't involved with it. He was my student, but I had nothing to do with the plot. I don't know what the fact is there. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But al-Awlaki is now on the run and has admitted that he had contact with the underwear bomber. And then in January of 2010, the Washington Post reveals that Anwar al-Awlaki is in fact on a kill list, on a kill list operated by the Joint Special Operations Command. So al-Awlaki, from that moment on until September of 2011, by my count, the U.S. tried to kill him at least a dozen times in a variety of drone strikes. While he's on the run, his children and his wife are living in Sana'a with his family, and they are going to good schools and living a normal existence, and the al-Awlakis are trying to keep those kids away from what's going on with their father. In early 2011, the CIA gets what it believes is a major break in the al-Awlaki case. In 2010, 2011, they get what they think is a major break in the al-Awlaki case. They are made aware of a Danish guy named Morten Storm, who was an old friend of al-Awlaki's from the mid-2000s in Yemen. They had attended some classes together. And Morten Storm was a former motorcycle gang member with a criminal record who was a convert to Islam and was sort of an aspiring jihadist. And he had known al-Awlaki before al-Awlaki had been put in prison. And Morten Storm sees that the United States now is trying to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, so he goes to the Danish intelligence service, the PET, and he goes, I think I can find Anwar al-Awlaki for you. And they get into this financial arrangement with this guy. He's going to help them find Anwar al-Awlaki. And he opens up an email communication with al-Awlaki, and they start corresponding. And then the CIA is made aware of Morten Storm, so then they come and they meet with them and they start working on a plot. How are they going to use this guy to get Anwar al-Awlaki? And what they come up with, and there's not many funny moments in my book, but I think this might be the only one. They come up with a plot to find a new wife for Anwar al-Awlaki that he can marry and live with underground. And the plan is to find this woman who can marry Anwar al-Awlaki and follow her and then kill both of them in a drone attack, but not tell her that she's part of the plot. So it's sort of like jihadist OkCupid. They put an ad on, the younger people in the room know what I'm talking about. They put an ad on Facebook, literally put an ad on Facebook, seeking a woman for Anwar al-Awlaki, and they get all of these responses. It's on the Anwar al-Awlaki group that this guy Morten Storm is running. And they finally settle on this woman who was from Croatia. She was a Catholic who converted to Islam, and she writes and says, I'd like to marry Anwar al-Awlaki. And she and al-Awlaki exchange a bunch of videos. They each record a video, and it's sort of, and we've seen the videos are now available. They're sort of like online dating in a way, except they haven't met each other yet. And eventually they decide, al-Awlaki says to her, oh, you have to be able to live in Spartan conditions and moving around a lot and not with many toiletries. And she's saying, oh, I'm willing to do that. I really love your work. And so then they eventually decide that Amina is her name. Amina is going to go and marry Anwar al-Awlaki. And al-Awlaki believes that his friend Morten Storm is helping him find a wife to be with him underground. Amina thinks she's going to go and marry this famous guy who, is someone that she admires, this imam. And so the CIA purchases or provides luggage to Amina with tracking devices on it. And the idea is that Amina is going to go with her CIA Louis Vuitton bags to Sana'a, and then she's going to go and meet up with al-Awlaki, and then they're going to kill both of them in this drone strike. So, I mean, it's so nonsensical. It's like The Spy Who Shagged Me, or something. It's just a bizarre. So she arrives in Sana'a, and al-Awlaki's people go to meet her at the airport, and they say, you got to ditch the bags, change your clothes. So they put her in all new clothes, ditch the bags. They take her. She marries Anwar al-Awlaki and has a kid with him and then lives underground with him for the rest of his life. The CIA's dating service. They provided a wife to Anwar al-Awlaki. Around that time, they also, to my understanding, she's still alive and is writing for Inspire magazine, the publication of English language publication of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So around that same time, the CIA approaches Anwar al-Awlaki's youngest brother, Ammar al-Awlaki, who works for an oil company, has almost nothing in common with his brother. And they approach him at a hotel in Vienna, Austria, and offer him $5 million to give up the location of his brother. And he says, I don't know the location of my brother. And then they sort of try to pressure him to go back and convince his family. And they say, $5 million is a lot of money. It could do a lot of good for his family. And they said to him, if we don't catch your brother soon, we're going to just kill him. And it would be in your interest to go and hand him over. So they're doing all this stuff behind the scenes. Then, in May of 2011, Osama bin Laden is killed. And JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, becomes like a household name. And Disney tries to trademark the term SEAL Team 6. And then Zero Dark 30, they change their script and start coordinating with the CIA and what's going to be told and what's not and how it's going to be told. And after bin Laden is killed, there's this sort of celebration of the special ops culture and the warrior culture in this country. And they set out to then try to run the deck. And they actually find al-Awlaki. And in May of 2011, a few days after bin Laden was killed, the U.S. does a drone strike on a vehicle that al-Awlaki is in, and the missile misses. And then al-Awlaki doesn't realize that it's a drone. He thinks maybe he's getting ambushed, so he sort of speeds up, and another missile is fired, and it misses him, and there's a huge dust up, and he calls for backup, and these two guys come to pick him up, and they create a dust storm around him. And they switch vehicles and drive out in the opposite directions. And the U.S. mission planners only had one more missile, so they had to choose which car to fire on. And so they fire and they direct hit the original vehicle, but it had those two brothers in it and not al-Awlaki. And al-Awlaki watched it from a nearby cliff, and so he survived that assassination attempt. But he wrote an essay after that saying, that these missiles missed their target tonight, but the next one may hit. And that brings us to where I started, which is that on September 30th, 2011, Obama's faced with this decision. They now know that al-Awlaki is in a specific house, and they've been monitoring him, and they just have to decide at what hour he's going to be killed. So while they're watching this house, which is in the north of Yemen, it's not even in al-Awlaki's tribal area, it's in the north of Yemen, Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, the eldest son of Anwar al-Awlaki, has just turned 16 years old. And he is sort of has a coming-of-age moment where he hasn't seen his father in a number of years, and decides that he's old enough to go and try to find his dad. So he sneaks into his mom's room and steals, very early in the morning, and steals the equivalent of $40 from her purse in Yemeni riyals, and leaves her a small note saying, I'm sorry for taking the money, I'll pay you back, but I need to find my father. And he sneaks out the kitchen window, and he takes a bus from the old city in Bab el-Yemen to Shabwa, where he thinks his father is. It's in the southern Yemen, because that's where most of the drone attacks had been taking place against his dad. So he goes there, and his plan is to try to find someone who knows his dad, he can meet up with him. While the kid is there, President Obama authorizes a drone strike on Anwar al-Awlaki, on his father, in the north of Yemen, and ends up killing not only Anwar al-Awlaki, but another American citizen as well, named Samir Khan. Samir Khan is a Pakistani American. I know his family as well. His mother told me that the FBI had repeatedly visited their house and told them that they were concerned about where Samir is. They knew that he was in Yemen, and they wanted to try to get him to come home, but they told the Khan family that there are no criminal charges against your son. And the Khans were saying, well, if there are no criminal charges against their son, how can you tell us that he needs to come back to the United States? And they said, well, we're just asking you to do that because we're concerned about what he might be involved with. And my understanding is that there was a grand jury that was convened to look at this guy, Samir Khan, and they didn't return an indictment. Now, this is only relevant for what I'm going to say next. So these two American citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, are killed in a drone strike. Neither of them had ever been charged with a crime. It's quite possible that the government had actually sought an indictment against Samir Khan and couldn't get it. It's hard to prove what happens in grand juries, but that's our understanding from anonymous sources. So these two Americans are killed, and the reaction in Washington basically fell into one of two camps: elation or silence. Hillary Clinton sounded just like John McCain. Lindsey Graham sounded just like Dianne Feinstein. There were joint statements galore being issued by political enemies to celebrate the killing of two American citizens by the democratically elected Nobel Peace Prize winning constitutional law expert, and it was like a big cause for celebration. One Republican congressman said, well, if Samir Khan wasn't also a target, then it was a bonus. It was a twofer, he called it, like a 2-for-1. The only people that raised a peep about this at the time in Congress were the predictable suspects, Congressman Dennis Kucinich and Representative Ron Paul. They were the only two that raised any question about this. And at the time, Ron Paul was waging his insurgent campaign for the Republican nomination and actually raised this issue, saying, how is it that the President of the United States can target an American citizen for assassination without even charging them with a crime when liberals were complaining about warrantless wiretapping when the Bush administration was doing it? I mean, isn't this a more extreme version of violation of rights? Dennis Kucinich had put forward a bill before al-Awlaki was killed that didn't even mention al-Awlaki by name and just said that the United States does not have the right to extrajudicially assassinate its own citizens without trial, and only 6 members of Congress signed on to that legislation. No members of the Senate signed on to it, just to give you a sense of the climate at that time in the United States. Then Obama goes and gives a speech at Fort Myer, and he says that Anwar al-Awlaki was the chief of external operations for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. No one that I know of in Yemen, including journalists who talk to al-Qaeda all the time, had ever heard that phrase before about Anwar al-Awlaki, that he was the head of external operations. But Obama didn't say, we killed him. He said an operation was conducted, you know, this sort of passive, you know, and that this guy somehow was just killed, you know, like the 46 women, children, and others that were killed in al-Majla were just killed by some force in the world, and we don't know whose press release to believe. So this happens. The al-Awlaki family is just, you know, devastated. They had written letters to the president saying, can you please charge our son with a crime if he did something so that we can actually respond to this, and they never got a reply. But Anwar al-Awlaki's son is stuck now in Shebwa, in this province, and the Arab Spring, what's called the Arab Spring, is happening. And there's a lot of fighting going on in Yemen, and his grandmother calls him and says, look, you know, your father is dead, it's over, you have to come home. And, you know, you're not going to be able to meet with him. And he says, you know, I'll come home after the road's clear and the fighting is done. I'll just stay with my aunt and uncle here. So he ends up staying for 2 weeks after his father's killed in this village with his relatives. And one night he goes out for dinner with his cousin Ahmed, who is 17, and a bunch of other kids from the tribe, and they go to an outdoor restaurant, and they're sitting there, and a drone appears above them and launches a missile and blows the kids up. And they couldn't even identify all of the bodies. They knew it was Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, and I encourage you to look at his pictures on the internet. He had this huge head of hair, like uncharacteristically massive head of hair, and it was like a teenage act of rebellion. His grandfather was constantly saying, cut your hair, and he said, no, this is my trademark. So he has this big head of hair. I got to know his friends and his family and the videos, and this kid had nothing to do with terrorism whatsoever, into hip-hop music and cartoons, hanging out in Change Square with the nonviolent revolutionaries who were trying to bring down the US-backed dictatorship. There is no one that's ever suggested even remotely that this kid had anything to do with terrorism. And yet he's killed in this attack. Why was he killed? So what we know about it from the initial reports is all in the form of leaks. One US military official leaks to a major US newspaper that he was actually 21 years old. So then the family produces his Colorado birth certificate showing he had just turned 16. Then they implied that he was actually an al-Qaeda sympathizer or a militant, and that he was at a meeting of al-Qaeda when he was killed, and that he was collateral damage. And then they said, oh no, he actually was meeting with this guy Ibrahim al-Bana, who's a propagandist for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Well, it turns out then Ibrahim al-Bana is still alive. So why was Abdulrahman al-Awlaki killed? I've spent months of my life trying to get an answer to this question. When Harry Reid was on CNN shortly after Abdulrahman al-Awlaki was killed, he was asked by Candy Crowley about the killing of these 3 American citizens in drone strikes. And Harry Reid said, well, I'm not going to discuss classified information, but I will say this. If there were 3 Americans that deserved to be killed, it was those 3 Americans. And so I went after Harry Reid, and I tried to get comment from his office. How is it that you would say this about this 16-year-old kid? What's your evidence that he deserved to be killed? Those are your words, that he deserved to be killed. And I started tweeting at his campaign fundraising site and at his official Senate site. And of course, if I had said I want to donate $500 to your campaign, I would have probably gotten a picture taken with Harry Reid, or maybe I would need to give more than that and be on par with the oil barons and everyone. But the point being, they provide no explanation. Then this young reporter named Sierra Adamson runs into Robert Gibbs, who was the former White House press secretary, At the time she met him, he was the chief surrogate, the chief spokesperson for the Obama re-election campaign in 2012. And she asks him, how is it that you killed this teenager, this American teenager, who had not been provided due process and wasn't charged with a crime? And Robert Gibbs' response was he should have had a more responsible father. No, there are few things I can think of that are more shameful than blaming the killing of a child on who their parent was. And not to mention, where was the kid living at the time? Was he underground with his dad? Was he plotting against the United States? He was living with his grandfather, a former government minister, a great friend of many US officials who had built an entire division of a university with American money being raised so that he could go to the United States and not live the life that his father lived. Al-Awlaki actually had done he was a responsible father. He didn't wrap his kids up at all in his business or the fact that he was underground. And there has never been an actual explanation given as to why this kid was killed. So today we have Eric Holder admitting that they specifically targeted Anwar al-Awlaki, even though he had never been charged with a crime. But then they said in the case of the other 3 Americans, they were, quote, not specifically targeted. What does that phrase mean, not specifically targeted? Well, the US is doing something, and I don't know what the facts are about this because we need to hear it from the people who ordered the mission as to why they killed this kid. But what I do know is that the United States is engaged in a policy called signature strikes in parts of Yemen and parts of Pakistan, where they preemptively determine that all military-aged males killed in those areas are militants and that their deaths are justifiable. So it's sort of a grotesque form of pre-crime, like that Tom Cruise movie Minority Report, where the ball comes popping up. Except the difference here is we don't actually have evidence that these people ever will commit a crime. It's a grotesque policy. So what we're doing is we are targeting people specifically, not specifically targeted, but we're targeting people specifically whose identities we don't even know. But think about how twisted that is. We're specifically targeting people whose identities we don't know and against whom we may not have any evidence that they're involved with any terror plots whatsoever. Maybe somebody went to the same mosque as someone that the US was watching. Maybe they delivered a pizza to the wrong mullah's house. And suddenly they're on the tracking. And then they're with a group of other military-aged males and, oh, well, we've got just a congregation of terrorists here. And oops, we killed a gym class. I mean, that is what is happening in parts of Yemen and parts of Pakistan. But I also think it's possible that Abdulrahman al-Awlaki was perhaps the target of that strike, that there was bad intelligence indicating that he was al-Qaeda or that he was 21. You know who suspected that? John Brennan. John Brennan at the time was the chief advisor to the president on counterterrorism and homeland security. I spoke to a former senior administration official who was in on the process of the kill program, a very senior official. He told me that Brennan believed that the kid was intentionally hit by either the CIA or JSOC, and that he didn't believe that it possibly could be a coincidence. I have trouble accepting that it's a coincidence. It's like some kind of tale from Greek mythology. You kill the father and then the son. What, are you killing him for who he might one day become? And so Brennan orders a review. And I asked this former official, well, what happened with the review? And he said, I don't know. So then I called the National Security Council and asked for comment on that. He said, we won't comment on whether we've done reviews or not. And then they emailed me a boilerplate statement that they emailed to any journalist who inquires about drone strikes. But then this former official says to me, but Jeremy, I assure you, it was all just a mistake. The kid was collateral damage. And I said, okay, well, if you're assuring me of that, then why don't you publicly say that? Why doesn't someone from this administration explain to the American people and to this family why this 16-year-old kid was killed 2 weeks after his father was killed? And he said, look, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is almost exact. You can look it up because I wrote this in an article. He says, look, we had just killed 3 American citizens in a 2-week period, 2 of whom weren't even targets, Samir Khan and Abdulrahman al-Awlaki. It didn't look good. It was embarrassing. That's the phrase. It was embarrassing. So the reason, if their line is correct, that the kid was collateral damage, it was an outrageous mistake, their current explanation for it, why they aren't going to explain that, is that it was too embarrassing to explain. For me, the answer to why Abdulrahman al-Awlaki was killed says a lot about who we are as a country. It doesn't just say, about the particulars of that incident. It says something about who we are. When you have the former White House press secretary blaming the killing of a kid on who his father was, and you have the Senate Majority Leader making a statement saying that those 3 Americans deserve to be killed, and you have a White House that puts secrecy on secrecy on secrecy something is rotten, is fundamentally rotten. And when it is a Democratic president who's putting the stamp of legitimacy on this, I imagine Dick Cheney fly fishing somewhere in Montana or wherever, and sort of having a good chuckle about how great it is that good old Obama cleaned it up so that they could continue with their wars. So the next time a Republican is in office, all they need to say is like, we'll just keep doing what that guy was doing. And liberals then, when they pick their consciences back up from the coat check of partisanship, then what are they going to say about this? What's their answer going to be when they were 70% supporting drone strikes and that the support dropped only negligibly when the target in question was an American citizen? We're going to look back a decade from now and realize that we crossed a line during this presidency where these institutions were made permanent. This White House has developed something called the disposition matrix, which is like an algorithm to determine who should live and die around the world, who might be able to be captured. They are formalizing the assassination process. They meet on Tuesdays in their Terror Tuesday meetings to go through rosters of people and decide who's going to live and die around the world. And then the baseball cards with stats on them are presented to the president. And then the president micromanages the assassination process. Take this person on, put this person off the list. This is happening under this Democratic administration. And it's happening in a broader context where President Obama claimed that he was going to shut Guantanamo. We now have scores of prisoners on hunger strike, more than 30 of them being force-fed in a very violent and brutal way. And every time there's anything that even whiffs of a terrorist incident in the United States or a terrorist plot, the Republicans call for them to be treated as enemy combatants, like this Jahar Tsarnaev kid in Boston, who's an American citizen. Lindsey Graham and others say he should be an enemy combatant. Don't Mirandize him. We have a culture now of militarized mob violence when these incidents happen. We're operating out of fear, and we have totally abandoned our principles when it comes to the specific crime of terrorism. But it's not just that issue. Law enforcement is being paramilitarized in this country. Calling it a war on drugs means that they have military solutions for it. You have a paramilitarization of the U.S. response to so many of its policies domestically and around the globe. And we have a Congress that is totally complicit in this, particularly during this administration. At least when Bush was in office, you had people using subpoena power at times, having aggressive investigations on Capitol Hill. There have been none of the right questions asked about the killing program, about the assassination program. The Democrats are totally silent. It took Rand Paul, a man who I've struggled to find something else I agree with that man on, beyond a sort of narrow scope of things. But Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, filibustered the nomination of John Brennan to be CIA director. Do people remember what happened the first time Obama tried to make John Brennan CIA director? Very early on in the first term, there was this discussion that Brennan was going to be CIA director, and even Democrats objected to it because of John Brennan's role in the CIA and his words of praise for what they, enhanced interrogation techniques, for torture techniques. John Brennan could not get confirmed, so they didn't put him through at that time because the Democrats were opposed to it. Fast forward to now, how things have changed. You only have Rand Paul on the floor of the Senate saying, I'm holding up this nomination. And about a third of that filibuster was some of the most sane discussion on the issue of assassination that has ever been said on the floor of the U.S. Senate. He read into the record articles from Spencer Ackerman and Glenn Greenwald and great reporting from around the world on drone strikes, and multiple times mentioned the killing of al-Awlaki. No one would ever mention that name until Rand Paul's filibuster. And the other two-thirds of it, though, turned into a carnival of crazy, which was really unfortunate. And discussions about, I think it's part of it's, the scary black president's going to come and drone strike the Tea Party meeting in the mountains of, wherever in the United States. And it's unfortunate that they did that the Tea Party folks veer into the weird conspiracy realm of Obama's a Kenyan socialist who's trying to destroy America from within in some kind of a Leon Trotsky Manchurian candidate mashup or something, that he's trying to bring down white America. So they ruin their moment when they actually could have raised serious questions. And Sarah Palin tweeting that she's against drone strikes, give me a break. If that nut got into the White House, she would be using drones every day. She probably would use them domestically, but it's politics for them. But the reason I'm saying this and getting into it and sort of messing with the Tea Party people is because where are the Democrats, the serious lawyer Democrats, who should be the ones standing there and saying, Mr. President, how does an American citizen get off the kill list when you haven't issued an indictment against them? That's a question that I want an answer to. When you don't have an indictment against you, how do you surrender to a drone? That's my actual question. I'm more concerned about what we're doing to non-Americans around the world than Americans, but at least there's a starting point here, because it's pretty hard to deny that American citizens have rights in this country, because we have a very nationalistic society. So we've got signature strikes where we're killing people whose identities we don't know, evidence against whom we may not even possess. We're using warlords and proxies in Somalia. We have continued to use the rendition program under President Obama. They may have shut down the CIA's black sites, as far as we know, in Poland and Thailand and elsewhere, but they're using other countries' black sites to hold prisoners that are rendered on orders from the United States. That's how much it's changed. It's been cleaned up, rebranded, and legitimized for a lot of liberals. That's going to be the enduring legacy of this White House when it comes to foreign policy on the issue of what's called counterterrorism or national security. Now, I want to wrap up so we have time for discussion. But I'll say this. I think all of us watched with horror these school shootings. Newtown and Sandy Hook, and then the Boston Marathon bombing, and the media coverage, of the Boston Marathon bombing and the immediate aftermath. So much of it was just racist and bigoted. And they put the picture of that kid on the cover of the New York Post, the kid who was in the tracksuit, and said, "Bagman, these are the guys the feds are looking for." And it turned out that this high school track runner, it's so bizarre that he actually would do this, was at the marathon to watch the marathon. But he was smeared because he looked Muslim, whatever that means. So we have that terrible coverage and so much erroneous coverage about who did this and who did that. But when the media, when journalists actually do their job, it's remarkable. We know who Carlos Arredondo is because of good reporting and because of an amazing photograph. And you may not know the name of the person I'm talking about, but I bet you know who Carlos Arredondo is. He was the guy in the cowboy hat who, when the Boston Marathon bombing happened, ran toward the blast and helped save the life of the double amputee, the guy who lost both of his legs. And you see Carlos Arredondo in his cowboy hat running this guy and actually saving his life. And Carlos Arredondo lost his son in Iraq. And has spent his life dedicated to the cause of peace. But we know his story, and we know the front page of the New York Times after that school shooting, where they had the names and the ages of the kids, 6 years old, 7 years old. I mean, it was heartbreaking. And we heard the stories of heroic teachers, and we heard the stories of who these kids wanted to be when they grew up. And there's the 8-year-old kid from Boston who had drawn that wonderful picture that went viral on Facebook calling for peace soon before he was killed in that bombing. And then you had President Obama mentioning the names of the 3 people that were killed in that bombing. And you had this young woman from Boston, and then you had this graduate student from China. And I was recently in Boston with a friend of a friend who's from China, and we were sitting down having dinner. And this was a week or so after the Boston Marathon bombing. And she said, when President Obama mentioned the name of that Chinese grad student, it was a huge story in China. And she said, the most powerful man in the world mentioned her name. And she said a blog post went viral, and the title of the blog post was, "Where You Die Matters." And the point of it was, if this Chinese woman had been killed in a factory making products for American consumers, the President of the United States never would have mentioned her name. But because she was killed in Boston, her life and her death mattered. There have been stories about what she was studying and who she wanted to be. And there's a lesson in that for all of us. We live in an infotainment society where reality television is reality, what Ramona and the Housewives, what Pinot Grigio they're drinking, or poodles they've purchased, or vacations they're going on to wherever. And the real widows of Baghdad or Mogadishu or Peshawar or Majula, where they barely get a mention. There was an image at one point, I took a picture of it, when the feds were about to raid, or the law enforcement was about to raid a home in Boston, and it turned out the Tsarnaevs weren't there, but they were about to raid it, and there was a little tiny news ticker at the bottom that said 27 killed in Baghdad cafe blast. What we did to Iraq has become an afterthought that most Americans never even think about anymore, unless they lost a loved one in Iraq. But almost no one is forced to remember what we did to that country, the hundreds of thousands of people that were killed. Every suicide bomb that goes off there has its roots in the fact that we invaded and occupied and destroyed Iraq. We created that horrible hellscape in that country. And I don't have answers. I used to think maybe that there's a program, and if we could do this, or you just pressure congressperson, or if you get this legislation to do that. I don't think a damn thing is going to change in this country until ordinary folks start making it their business to care about what's being done in our name around the world. And one way you can care about that is to focus on something that may not seem related, and that is getting huge corporate money out of our election campaigns. Nothing is going to change unless corporations stop calling the shots. When war contractors, if you look at war spending, war contractor spending on elections, people may assume that they just always give more to the Republicans. No, no, no. They look which way the wind is blowing. When the Democrats are going to win, they know it, and they start pouring in more money to the Democratic campaign coffers. And when the Republicans are going to win, then they tilt back in their direction. But when you have members of Congress serving 2-year terms, they're spending probably 75% of those terms raising funding for their next elections. But if you have a big defense contractor who's going to come in and write you the fat check, you think that they're not going to expect something in return for that? There is no incentive to vote against policies that make the toys being made for the war machine all the more profitable. You know, you've got drone production is increasing. Each of those cruise missiles are a couple $1 million. You have special operations forces expanding around the world. Obama has kept mercenaries on the US payroll, continues to work with Blackwater's latest iteration. The campaign process in this country is infected by the cancer of huge corporate influence. And we only have one party, really, in this country when it comes to foreign policy. Obama was supposed to be the man who cleaned it all up and hit the reset button with the world. And yet I think our image around the world has actually, and it's shocking to say this because of how bad and awful Bush and Cheney were, has been degraded even further. Because I think a message has been sent that it actually doesn't matter who the Americans elect. Nothing's going to fundamentally change. But I have faith, and it's a long shot, but I have faith that if we start to actually internalize what we're doing abroad and make it part of our business to care about it, and each of us says, I'm going to take one person, one story of a person who was killed in one of these strikes, who was an innocent civilian, and I'm going to get to know 5 or 6 facts about who that person was. And the next time someone uses the term collateral damage or casualties, I'm going to tell them that story and remind them that these are people. I said at the beginning of the speech that there shouldn't be any difference in how we view the lives of Americans and non-Americans. Our lives are not worth more than theirs. But from the idea that American exceptionalism rules the day and that our lives are worth more stem all of these policies. We need to confront that head on, and we need to wage our own hearts and minds campaign. That's our challenge. Thank you very much.